wraps himself in light. Darkness tries to hide, trembles at his voice, trembles at his voice. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God? Oh, we'll see how great is our God. Age to age he stands, time is in his hand, beginning and the end, beginning and the end. Godhead three in one, Father, Spirit, Son, Lion and the Lamb, Lion and the Lamb. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God? Oh, we'll see how great is our God. Name above all names, worthy of all praise. My heart will sing, how great is our God. Name above all names, worthy of all praise. My heart will sing, how great is our God. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God? Oh, we'll see how great is our God. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God? Oh, we'll see how great is our God.
Place, Lord, and prepare to open your word. I am just praying, Lord, that you would bless it. Would it come alive? Would you speak to us tonight? I just pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good evening, everybody. How are you guys? Hot? I mean, that's not surprising. It's pretty hot. It's going to be hot all week. Oh, boy. But it's not as hot as it is over in the desert in Palm Springs, Indio. My sister lives out in Indio, so I think it's been getting up to 125. Something like that out there. It's crazy. And it doesn't cool down there like it does here, you know? I mean, we're blessed. Like, at least at night. I'm a little upset right now because it's only cooling down to like 70. You know, it's like, come on, Lord, get us down to 60, you know? Like, you can open the windows and, but, I mean, what do we have to complain about? 70 is not that bad. So, anyways, yeah, it is hot. So I had the privilege of going last night to Chino Hills. I had dinner with a group of pastors, and had a chance to meet and listen to Steve Garvey, who's a candidate running for U.S. Senate. Um, and I was really impressed, actually, you guys. I, um, I walked away. My big takeaway was I really like this guy. He's running against Adam Schiff, and there was supposed to be a debate between the two of them at Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills, with Pastor Jack, and Adam Schiff was a no-show, and so anyway, so it was just a one-sided kind of deal with Steve Garvey and Steve Hilton, but it was a good night. Um, Steve Garvey said a couple things that stood out in my mind at our dinner that we had. And I'll just repeat them to you because I thought they were really cool. He says, the two greatest days in a person's life are the day that you're born and the day that you discover why. I thought, well, that's pretty profound. The two most important days in a person's life are the day that they're born and then the day that they discover why. I wonder if you've discovered why. That's one of the big questions in life that most people wrestle with. The other thing he says, God's gift to you was your life. And your gift to God is the way you choose to live it. And so I thought, well, that's pretty good too. He must have gotten that from somebody else. I don't think he made that up, but God's gift to you is your life, and your gift to God is the way that you choose to live it. And so I think that's so true. I want to look at some headlines that are on the news this week. I'm not going to be talking about any of the political things happening here in the U.S. necessarily, but I do want to look at some things happening on the global level, on the global scale. And we'll look at a couple things, one or two things here locally that I thought were pretty interesting. But the first headline is this, and as you are probably aware, the war in Ukraine is still raging, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. It's actually, in fact, it's not slowing down. It's ramping up. And, and from a spiritual perspective, from a biblical perspective, this is expected, by the way. Jesus said that in the latter days there'll be wars and rumors of wars. It's not that we want wars. We're not looking for wars. War is a terrible thing, but it is evidence that Jesus' words are true and that we are living in the last days. Somebody said recently that there's over 30 wars that are happening currently in the world right now. Now, most of them are small, but, another of the wars is happening in Israel, between Israel and Hamas. And we'll talk about that in a second, but this is the headline that I want to share with you. This comes out of Al Jazeera News, which I always like to read Al Jazeera because it's a Muslim run news organization. So they have their own slant and take on what's happening globally. But this headline reads this. It just says, Russia blames the war on NATO as it pounds Ukraine and demands territory for talks. And so just to summarize, just this week, just within the last few days, Russia has been sending, a couple of days ago, they sent waves of missiles into Kiev and deep into Ukraine. In fact, there were two waves of about 40 missiles that were launched deeper into Ukraine. There was a hospital that was damaged. Now, there's a children's hospital. There's mixed stories coming out as to who's at fault for that. Now, quickly the headline said, Russia bombed a children's hospital. Russia immediately responded and said, that was not us. That was friendly fire. And now I've been watching the headlines. I don't know who to believe, to be honest with you. I've been watching the headlines to try to figure out, well, what's the truth? And I don't know. The short answer is I don't know. I don't know if it was a Russian missile or if it was a Ukrainian missile that went awry that hit this hospital. But nevertheless, some organizations news outlets are blaming Russia. Some are saying it's inconclusive. But it's just interesting. But but nevertheless, there were several people that were killed in these bombings, in these missile attacks. And Russia has offered a peace treaty with the West. Terms for peace, I guess, if you want to call it. I don't know if you've heard this, but the terms for peace that they've offered are, we keep all of the land, all the territory that we have taken, all the Russian-speaking lands, okay, in exchange for a ceasefire, okay. Now, there's two components to their plan. It's, we will stop, if you agree to let us keep the land, we'll stop the military progress. You also need to agree to stop. Then we can sit down at the table and negotiate. And what Russia wants to negotiate with Ukraine and the West is not just a ceasefire, but that the West will agree that Ukraine will never join NATO, okay? Now, why would Russia want Ukraine to never join NATO? Well, because NATO will put missiles on the border of Russia. Okay, this is why they don't want this. They say, we don't want missiles on our border, so we want to guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO. Now, full disclosure, you guys, just to educate you a little bit if you haven't been watching this, Ukraine has applied for NATO membership. They've submitted applications, if you will, for NATO membership. The applications keep getting denied by NATO, and the reason that they're getting denied is because Ukraine is extremely corrupt. All right? NATO has historically, in the last decade or so, and even up till recently, has denied Ukraine's bid to become a NATO nation because Ukraine is too corrupt. They can't trust the leadership in Ukraine. And so Ukraine is consistently and still to this day advocating for membership into NATO, and NATO continues to say, no, you're still too corrupt. Now, it seems to be a conflict of messages coming out of NATO and the U.S. because NATO including the U.S. is sending billions of dollars into Ukraine to fund this fight against Russia. The reason why Russia invaded Ukraine, according to the Russians, is because they didn't want missiles on their borders. And they were saying, we don't want missiles on our borders. Stop trying to put missiles on our borders. And so anyways, this is what I can gather from all of this. And Russia is blaming this war on NATO. That's what they're saying. They're saying, look, we can stop this now if you just agree to not put missiles on our border, okay? It seems pretty reasonable in my mind, just to be honest with you. Now, from a biblical standpoint, we know that the Bible, particularly in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, that the Bible tells us that Russia, during the last of the last days, that Russia will rise to great prominence and power and will lead a coalition of nations in a war against Israel. It's very interesting. And so Russia is not going to become weaker, but Russia will become stronger. Now, the West is trying to make Russia weaker, but the Bible tells us that they will increase in strength. And then they will lead a coalition of nations, including most likely Turkey and Iran and probably Libya, in a fight, and Syria as well, in a fight against Israel. We also know that the Bible tells us that Damascus will one day be a thriving city, and then the next day will be obliterated. It's going to be wiped out. Damascus, just so you know, is in Lebanon. It's not in the Israel proper. It's just across the border in Lebanon. It is a historically Jewish city, but it is across the border in Lebanon. So, very interesting things that are happening. Ukraine is losing the war. There's no way to slice that pie in any other way than just to say Ukraine is losing the war. And I really believe that, well, depending on who is in leadership after this next election in the U.S., I really believe that there will be a peace treaty negotiated with Russia, and there will be peace brought to that region. Now, Russia will be more powerful. There's no way to slice this any other way. They are going to be more powerful after all this. They're becoming more powerful. They've turned their economy into a war machine. They're producing more than double the amount of arms that they were just 2 years ago. Their military has increased by fourfold. They have now a 1.2 million person standing army, which, by the way, the entire United States military, all branches of the military, number about 1.2 million. Russia's army itself now numbers 1.2 million. And that doesn't include their Air Force and their Navy and all the other branches that consist within the Russian military. Anyways, yes, it is an interesting time. So we need to be watching, and honestly just be praying for peace. This is my prayer always, is just, Lord, would you grant peace? There's some estimates coming out of the war that over 600,000 Ukrainians have been killed, 1 million casualties, those who've been injured or wounded. Russia has experienced a number of casualties as well, but far less than the Ukrainians. These are numbers that we haven't heard in a very long time. You guys remember back in Vietnam that the United States experienced about 50,000 plus casualties in Vietnam. Well, Ukraine in the last 2 years has experienced over 600,000 casualties. Just to put it in perspective, this is a war of attrition, and the Russians are winning. So we need to be praying. We need to be careful. We need to be watching. Which brings me to the next war that I just want to mention. This is a headline that comes out of CBN News, and the headline just reads this. Just to remind you, there's two fronts of the Israeli war. Why is the war in Israel so important? Because Israel, according to Bible prophecy, is going to be the place where Jesus returns and he reestablishes his rule and reign on earth, okay? The temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem according to the book of Revelation, and the Antichrist will come into the temple during the last days and will declare himself to be God. All eyes are on Israel in a spiritual sense, but ironically, all eyes in a physical sense in our world are on Israel. It seems that the whole world is focused on Israel, this tiny little nation state. And Israel is waging a two-front war now against Hamas and Hezbollah. Hamas is in the south in Gaza. Hezbollah is a much larger force in the north in Lebanon, okay? And Israel is wrapping up the fight in Gaza. They're trying to eliminate Hamas, the terrorists that killed 1,200 Israelis on October 7th and took 100 or over 200, somewhere in the neighborhood, Israelis hostage. They have yet to free over 100 of the hostages. They're still trying to get their people back. And now Hezbollah to the north of Israel has launched attacks against Israel. So the headline coming out of CBN News is just simply this. Hezbollah rockets rained down on the Golan Heights, which is the northern region of Israel, killing a man and a woman. In fact, there were dozens and dozens of rockets that were launched from Lebanon, from Hezbollah into Israel. And unfortunately, the Iron Dome was overwhelmed. It was unable to shoot down all of the rockets, and several got through, killing a couple of Israelis and injuring several others. Israel has already publicly said that they are fighting a two-front war. They've already publicly said that they will defeat Hezbollah to the north, which, like I said, is a much, much bigger military force. And so I don't think we're seeing the end of the fighting in Israel anytime soon. It's just ratcheting up. Where does the U.S. stand in all of this? Well, I heard just today that the United States has approved sending weapons back into Israel, the weapons that they were holding back, and so helping the Israelis to fight this battle. And just to be clear, if Israel stops fighting, they will all be killed. That's just the reality of it. That they are living in a land where they have enemies on every single side. And Iran, who is the great evil over there, is funding all these groups and is determined to wipe out Israel. And as soon as they drive over Israel, they're coming for us. They want to destroy the U.S. They call the United States the great Satan and Israel the little Satan. Why do they hate us? Well, I'm going to tell you why they hate us. Because historically, the United States is a Christian nation, that we are a God-fearing people. Now, it seems that America is changing, that we are no longer a Christian nation and a God-fearing people. But we're still known globally as that, and Iran hates us for it. They want to kill us. You remember I've told you that the battles that we're witnessing are being directed in the invisible world. These are invisible battles. And so we just need to keep in mind that we're waging a spiritual war. This is not a physical war, although yes, we're seeing it play out in the physical sense, but this is a war against good and evil. It's a war against God and his armies and Satan and his armies. And yes, this war is going to come to its fullness during the last part of the last days with the great battle of Armageddon. That will be the culmination of this great cosmic conflict. But we're seeing the rumblings of that. Jesus described these times as birth pains. He said it'll be like birth pains that come on a woman when she is in labor. And as you know, a woman in labor experiences birth pains, and the closer she gets to giving birth, the pains intensify and they come quicker. And so that was the way he described that these times would be. I want to turn our attention to some positive news. This also comes out of CBN. And actually, no, this isn't positive. Let's look at this one first. This one bothers me a little bit. I'm like, you traitor. This is Kirk Cameron. So this was the headline. Kirk Cameron didn't feel, quote, safe in California, and he moved his family to the state that values God, family, and country. Can anybody guess what state he moved to? No, it wasn't Texas. That would have been my first guess. Tennessee. He moved his family to Tennessee. I'm like, you traitor, Kirk Cameron. What is wrong with you? You know, and so, you know, he was living in L.A. Or in Ventura, I forget where, but somewhere over there, forever. I mean, you know, since his days on, what was that show? Family Ties? Growing Pains, yeah. Since his days on Growing Pains. Anyways, he's a traitor, he's a sellout. I still like him, but, you know, whatever, Kirk Cameron. So I guess he wasn't strong enough. He couldn't hold up under the weight. What a loser. I mean, anyways, no, I'm just kidding. No, he's done some good things. I'm teasing. But anyways, yeah, a lot of people are leaving California. They're calling it the Great Exodus. And in the article here that with this headline of Kirk Cameron leaving, Kirk Cameron says, you know, some of the winners in this Exodus are U-Haul. U-Haul is a winner. Like, they're making a ton of money as people are leaving this great state of California. But you know what? What I loved about Steve Garvey and his campaign is, you know, he's a native Californian. He played for the Dodgers. He's lived here the majority of his life. He said over 50 years. What I love about Steve Garvey was he said, look, I'm not leaving. He plans to die here. He says, but I'm going to stay and fight, and we're going to take back this state. And so I'm like, right on, Steve. Let's go. Let's take back California. And I want to remind you that the answer for California, by the way, is not Steve Garvey. Don't mistake me and listen to this. This is not Steve Garvey. He's not the answer to California. The answer for California is Jesus Christ, okay? So we need to bring Jesus Christ and the gospel message into the dark places of our state, of our city, of our valley here, of our county, because Jesus has the power to change people's lives, and revival is what's going to change this state. And so, you know, we need to be prayerful that God would move in a powerful way. I heard somebody say that we deserve the wrath of God, the judgment of God. When you look at our nation, when you look at the state of California, we are we are deserving of the judgment of God. I mean, there's no way to look at that any different way than, look, God has every right to judge us, to pour out his wrath on this place. Every right. I mean, you look at the laws that are passed. You look at the way that people are living their lives. You look at the craziness and the unrighteousness that is just everywhere. And the rejection of God's righteous standards and the rejection of his word and the rejection of his son Jesus. He has every right to judge us. So with that in mind, my prayer, and I want to encourage you to pray this way too, is that God would demonstrate great mercy and grace over us, and that he would pour out his Spirit upon this place once again, and that we would experience a changing of people's hearts and a revival. This is the hope of our state and of our nation. And, we live in a special place. California is a special place. It used to be that California was the envy of the world. Everyone wanted to live in California. If you traveled the world and you said, I was from California, they automatically thought that you were a movie star and a surfer. It was just the way it was, They're like, oh, you must be a movie star and you must surf. And I remember when I moved to California from Texas, that was what I thought. I was like, well, everybody's a surfer. I moved to Hemet. I realized I'm far from the beach here. There's no surfers. And I remember in high school, one kid says to me, he says, you're from Texas? And I said, yeah. He says, you guys ride horses to school? And I said, no. Do you guys ride surfboards to school? And so, we had a good laugh, but yes, California was, and it should be, the envy of the world. It's one of the most beautiful places that God has ever created. I mean, you think about where we live. It's an incredibly beautiful place. And the weather is the envy of the world. People move to Florida, but I'm telling you, Florida has nothing on California. It is so humid there. I would not want to live there, but people are flocking there. But California has some of the best weather. We have some of the best beaches. We have the best mountains. We have the best deserts. It is a beautiful and a diverse place. It's beautiful. Everything good about California is something that God touched. Everything bad about California is something that man has touched or created. All the beautiful things of California were created by God. All of the mess that we experience here has been created by man. And so we need to turn back to God. He's the answer to our problems. So yes, Kirk Cameron moved to Tennessee, and guess what? Just last week, the beginning of last week, so a week and a half ago, began a month-long 31-day of prayer for the entire state of Tennessee. So this headline comes out. It just says this. It says, this state is publicly seeking God after the governor of Tennessee declared 31 days of prayer and fasting. By the way, isn't it great that there are still states in the United States that are coming out and saying this as a whole state? Just to remind you guys, we just came off of a citywide month of prayer in June, as our city council had declared that here for our city. So it's a wonderful thing that we live here in this valley, but the state of Tennessee has done the same. Yes, the state is publicly seeking God after the governor declares 31 days of prayer and fasting. So not all hope is lost. I really believe that we are living in the midst of one of the greatest spiritual battles the world has ever seen. And we're seeing it play out in real time right before our eyes, as governors are declaring states months of prayer and fasting, as other governors are declaring their states sanctuary states for gender-affirming surgeries and for some of these other crazy things that we're experiencing. What a crazy time to be alive. By the way, I hope that you see that it's a wonderful time to be alive. This is a great time to be alive. We're walking through the book of Daniel. Daniel didn't get to choose when he was born, okay? He just happened to be born and grow up in a time when he was a teenager, and the the Babylonians came in and took all of him and his friends and his neighbors and his family captive. They became enslaved to this pagan empire and these pagan people. And they find themselves in a foreign land, in a crazy place that's worshiping pagan gods and all of these crazy things. And so it would have been easy for Daniel and all of his friends to say, woe is me. I wish I hadn't been born during this time. I think I'm just going to crawl in a hole and try to live out my life in secret and just, not offend anybody, not do anything crazy, not, rock the boat. I'm just going to sort of be quiet in this place and just sort of settle into the fact that, look, the world's falling apart around us, and I'm just going to just resolve in my mind that we'll just make the best we can of it, and that'll be it. I love that these guys didn't do that. I love that they lived their faith out in public, that they were unashamed of their God and who they served, and no matter where they found themselves, even at this time, which was very challenging, far more challenging, by the way, for them than it is for you and I. We still have freedom. We can still sit in a church building like this and worship and praise our God. There was no option for that for them. There was no church where they went, and the churches that did exist were pagan temples. And so, yes, they were slaves and prisoners in a foreign land, and yet they refused to bow to pagan gods. They lived out their faith with boldness, and because of it, God put a hedge of protection around them, and not only did He protect them and save their lives, but He elevated them to high levels of prestige in the land. It's quite an amazing thing to listen to and to read as we read through this. But yes, this is the story of Daniel. I'm really excited because 2 weeks ago, we weren't meeting last week, but 2 weeks ago, we started the chapter that is the most famous chapter maybe in all of the Old Testament. For some, it might be the most famous chapter in all of the Bible. It may be one of the most famous stories in all of the Bible. It's the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And so here we find ourselves in Daniel chapter 6. By the way, Daniel, as we get to chapter 6, is about 86 years old. All right? He's no longer a young man. You remember in Daniel chapter 1 when he was taken captive, he was a teenager. Well, he's lived in captivity for 70 some odd years in a foreign land, away from his homeland, away from the temple where he could worship the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. He's far from that place. For 70 years he's lived in this pagan world. And so we're on the theme of standing strong in a pagan world. And there's no better example of this than Daniel. And so, yes, this is one of the great stories of the Bible. It's a story, by the way, of how politics sort of impacted Daniel's life, okay? We're going to read in the story of Daniel in the lion's den how politics was used to pass laws that would entrap Daniel and lead to him being sentenced to death. You have to understand that when Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, it was a death sentence. We read it in hindsight and we're like, well, we've sort of, made it into cartoons and we have kids' stories about it and our kids pretend and we, in Sunday school classes around the world, people are telling the story of Daniel in the lion's den and we've got little Daniel puppets and lion puppets, and we made it into this little kid-friendly story, but you got to understand, this was a death sentence. This wasn't fun and games. This was a death sentence. He was sentenced to death. And we're going to read here as we read this that death was inevitable. Nobody survived being thrown into the lion's den. It's just like when we read about those three Hebrew friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When they were thrown into the fiery furnace, nobody survived that. It's a death sentence. They were sentenced to death. Daniel is going to find himself sentenced to death. And it's a crazy story because the king actually likes Daniel, and Daniel is lifted up once again to being the third highest ruler in the kingdom. He is sitting in the cabinet of the presidency, okay? He's the third highest guy in the land. And yet he finds himself victim to corruption, political malfeasance, if you will, hatred, all of these things, and he finds himself trapped, okay, by the politicians of the day, and he is sentenced to death. The king himself, by the way, likes Daniel, but he is fooled. He's not a wise king. He's fooled. He passes a law that he can't reverse, and thus Daniel is sentenced to death. This king, by the way, his name is Darius. And you remember early on in the book of Daniel, we were introduced to another king. Do you remember what his name was? It starts with an N. King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar was considered the greatest monarch to ever live. You remember the dream he had of the man, the statue, right? And the dream he had was a prophetic dream. It was a dream of the empires that would rise, including his. And the head of that great statue was a golden head. It was the symbol of his kingdom, of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. God declared that he was the greatest monarch to have ever lived. King Nebuchadnezzar was not bound by any laws. He was himself the law. What he said was law. He could change his mind at any time. If he said this was the way it was going to be, and then 5 seconds later decided to change his mind, he had the right to do that. Darius did not have that same power. He was not the greatest monarch to ever live. And so this new Persian empire that has risen to power, that has sort of taken over the Babylonians, is a lower form of monarchy. It is a lesser monarchy, is a lesser power. They're ruled by laws and decrees instead of by a single person who has all the power. So when Darius signs or passes a law, he's bound by the rules of the nation of those laws. He can't reverse it. All right? Just like in the United States, we have laws that you can't reverse. There's a set of rules and regulations you have to go through if you're going to change a law, and it's quite cumbersome. It's very difficult. Well, for Darius, it was the same. So let's read this, you guys. I'm going to just start reading in verse 1. Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. And just a reminder, Daniel had interpreted the writing on the wall from the previous chapter, which so impressed these guys that Daniel rose to great prominence in the kingdom once again. This is a theme in his life. He keeps rising to power. He doesn't want the power. He doesn't want the prestige, but he keeps being given it. God is blessing him. Verse 1. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them. Guess who's one of the 3? Daniel, yes. One of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. They were to be the king's council. It's like the cabinet of the president. He brings these people in. They keep everything running smooth and straight. That's their job. Now it says in verse 3, now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. This is incredible. So at this, when the word got out that Daniel was going to be elevated not only to the third in charge over all of the wise people in the cabinet, but that he was going to be elevated to in charge of everybody, they got upset. They got jealous. And by the way, they didn't like Daniel because he's also a Jew. He's a Hebrew. He's worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's worshiping Yahweh. They didn't like him for that. There was some hatred there because of that. And so at this, it says in verse 4, the administrators, so there's 2 other administrators, right? And the satraps, there's 120 of those. They tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. By the way, let me just pause for a second. If we brought in Gavin Newsom and we tried to find grounds or charges against him in his governmental affairs. Or let's say we brought in any of our other elected officials. I mean, you name it, any of them. And we said, let's see if we can find any charges against you. It would not be hard. I think almost all of them. I can't even think of one, to be honest with you, that we would not be able to find charges against. It's a remarkable thing that Daniel was living a life of such character that they did a deep dive. They looked into his past. You know, they interviewed his friends. They were trying to find something against him. And they could not. This is crazy, right? You know, when somebody runs for office, they always dig into their past to try to find all the ugliness, you know, like were they ever arrested? Do they have a criminal record? You know, did they have a speeding ticket? I can't run for office, you guys, because they're going to find out that I have a lot of speeding tickets in my past. They're going to be like, oh, this guy's a crazy driver. And so it's there. They're going to find it. They were unable to do so, it says in verse 4. They couldn't find any grounds of charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. And listen to this. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy. And he was neither corrupt nor was he negligent. He wasn't even negligent. They couldn't even find a time where he was like, you know, he kind of slacked on the job over here a little bit. They couldn't even find that. I mean, this guy's incredible. I'm like, we need more Daniels in our world. And so, yes, he was bringing his very best every day. And because he was bringing his very best every day, he was, in a sense, blameless. They couldn't find anything against him. And by the way, this is how government works. It's really sad. Government works this way. Government is all about power. And how do you get power over somebody? Well, the easiest way is to find some dirt on them. And then you use it to manipulate them. Right? You're like, hey, I got some dirt on you, and if you don't fall in line, I'm going to use this to manipulate you. And so this happens all the time in government. All the time. And so, yes, government was the problem, which should not be a shocker, by the way. Is government the problem? Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, yeah, it's the problem. Why? Because it's run by a bunch of corrupt people. Now, if there were people like Daniel running the government, it wouldn't be a problem. I want to go back to, or fast forward, I guess, in the Bible, to the book of Romans. Paul talks about government. I want to read what he says about government. By the way, government in and of itself is not bad. Government is God's idea. His idea is to have a government, okay? It's God's idea. But it's got to be done in the right way. In Romans chapter 13, if you have your Bibles, you can turn there and read this with me. I'm just going to read 2 verses. Romans chapter 13, verse 3. God's plan for government. Okay, this is kind of the subtitle for these verses here in Romans 13. And listen to this. Verse 3, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. Now listen to this. And this is a message to government officials. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. Listen, if the one in authority is not God's servant, we got a real problem. If the one in authority isn't God-fearing or a servant of God, we got a real problem. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. In other words, there's a right way and a wrong way. You know, the problem with government is that they often want to define the right way and the wrong way outside of the context of God's word. Now, government's God's idea. He created it. It's his plan to have government well, but it has to be done in the right way. And so, yes, there is right and there is wrong. And what Paul's saying is, he says, listen, if you do right, which, by the way, is a form of righteousness, it's right living before God. If you do right, then the servants of God, God's servants who are leading in government, you'll be blessed by it. You won't have any problems. But if you're doing wrong, then God's servants, those who are God-fearing agents of God, they will bring punishment to you. You're going to end up in a lot of trouble. And so, but the breakdown of society comes into play when people get the whole idea of right and wrong all mixed up, and then they reject God entirely. And so, yes, government is God's idea, but government oftentimes becomes the problem. That was the case for Daniel. He was a government official, by the way, but he was probably the only government official who was actually blameless. The rest of them were a hot mess, probably. So verse 5, back to Daniel 6. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So they're going to try to create a scenario where Daniel, as he practices his faith, is condemned because of it. Okay? It's an interesting thing when a nation creates laws that would be in contrast to the laws of God, and that would be in contrast to what God has called and commanded people to do. We're about to witness this in firsthand here in Daniel's life. They're going to fabricate a law, get the king to sign it and seal it, that would outlaw the practice of Daniel's faith. In other words, it would outlaw him from being able to pray to Yahweh, to Jehovah, to his God. It would be declared illegal. Now, someone once asked the question, if Christianity were outlawed, would there be enough evidence in your life to convict you? It's a worthwhile thought. You know, for Daniel, they saw that there was enough evidence. If his religion was outlawed, which that's what they're about to do, there would be enough evidence to convict him. If Christianity were outlawed, if it was declared illegal to be a follower of Jesus, would they find enough evidence in your life to convict you? If the answer is no, then you're really not a genuine follower of Jesus. You've got to do some real self-examination. So verse 6, the plot thickens. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king, and they said, may King Darius live forever. These guys are suck-ups. These guys are the worst of the worst, okay? You ever been around somebody like that? You just want to poke their eyes out or something. You know, you're like, you little rat, you know? Like, these guys are just rats, man. May King Darius live forever. They're full of flattery and praise for the king, and he's eating it up, you know. He's like, yeah, that's right. May I live forever, right? And so verse 7, the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed. I underline this in my Bible, by the way, because they're liars. They're liars. They're coming with all this flattery, and they're liars. They have not all agreed because only 2 of the 3 administrators have agreed. Daniel's been left out of the conversation. And so they've lied to the king. We've all agreed. The king, oh, you've all agreed. Well, that's incredible. It's hard to get a government official to agree on anything. You guys have all agreed. This is incredible. So, we've all agreed, they said, that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, you got to understand, I said this before, thrown in the lion's den is a death sentence. That they shall be put to death. And with all the flattery and the lies, the king's like, well, you guys, thanks for the flattery. I mean, this is awesome. I mean, I agree. Like, let's make this law a thing, you know? I mean, he's full of pride. Verse 8, they continue, now your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius puts the decree in writing. He's been fooled. He's been tricked. And what got into his head was pride and arrogance and all these things. It was the flattery. It was all of that stuff. Be careful, by the way, when someone comes with you with great flattery. For two reasons. One, it's going to get to your head, which it did for Darius. And two, they may have ulterior motives, which is what these guys had, okay? They had ulterior motives, and it was really playing into Darius's ego, okay? He was soaking it all up. I want to read a quote to you from Charles Spurgeon, okay? I really like Charles Spurgeon as a preacher. He lived only to be 57 years old, but he was one of the greatest preachers, I think, of all time. 1834 to 1892 was his life. But here's a quote as he talks about this scene here in Daniel. He says, "Suppose the law of the land were proclaimed, that no man," and I want you to understand, this was written over 150 years ago. Okay? "Suppose the law of the land were proclaimed that no man shall pray during the remainder of this month, on pain of being cast into a den of lions. How many of you would pray? I think there would be rather a scantly number of at the prayer meeting. Not but what the attendance at prayer meetings is scantly enough now," he says. "But if there were the penalty of being cast into a den of lions, I'm afraid that the prayer meeting would be postponed for a month, owing to pressing business and manifold engagements of one kind or another." In other words, people would say, you know what? We've got other things that we can do during these 30 days. Let's focus on that, and we'll just pray. We'll have our prayer meeting in 31 days. How many people would do that? Pretty much everybody. Everyone except for Daniel. Now, these guys knew that Daniel was such a committed follower of God that he would not wait 30 days. They were banking on it. They were like, oh no, he's going to pray. He's definitely going to pray. He does it every day. And this guy he's like clockwork every day. And they knew that he loved God with all of his heart, soul, mind, and strength. They knew that he had this relationship with God, and that's why they passed this law. It was the only way they thought they could trap him, and they got him. The king put it in writing, and it was irreversible. He had been tricked. Now, if it had been Nebuchadnezzar, remember I told you, he would have reversed it instantly, and he would probably thrown those guys into the lion's den. But because Darius was bound by the laws of the land, he wasn't the perfect monarch. It had to be followed through with. So verse 10. Now Daniel hears about the decree. What's he going to do? All right? Is he going to hide? Is he going to close the curtains in his house so that he can still pray in private and nobody will know? What's he going to do? Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, so he hears about it, he's like, you know what? I'm going home to pray. He went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. By the way, people pray at the Western Wall in the city of Jerusalem. Why do they pray at the Western Wall? Anybody know why? Because the wall historically faced the temple. And that's where God dwelled, in the Holy of Holies. So the people would pray at the Western Wall to face the city of Jerusalem. There's a prayer in 2 Chronicles, I believe, that Solomon prays. I think I'm saying this right. You'll have to check me on this, you guys. But where he basically sets this precedent of praying towards the temple. Okay, the temple's being built and dedicated in 2 Chronicles 6, 7, and so this practice was done by the early Jewish people. They would pray towards the temple, and so here Daniel opens the windows towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day. Now, I don't know if this was his practice before, but it is now. 3 times a day now, he got down on his knees. I love this. And he prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So yes, maybe it was his practice to do it 3 times. By the way, someone said this. I thought it was a great statement. Daniel knew that the safest thing he could do was to radically obey God. the safest thing he could have done in this situation was to continue to be a radical in his obedience to God. He was the only one that we know of who actually defied the king's decree and prayed. And by the way, didn't hesitate. Immediately, he goes home and prays. He's like, well, if it's the law, it's not going to stop me. And he went home and prayed. I want to get off on a little tangent here just for a second. You remember in the spring of 2020 when COVID happened and the churches were shut down, and then the state of California came out and declared that we couldn't meet, that we needed to stop singing together in churches, that it was declared illegal. And it was under the guise of stopping the spread, right? And so many churches complied with that. Many churches shut down. Many churches stopped meeting. Many churches stopped singing publicly together and worshiping God. Listen, I don't think it's much different back then, just a few years ago, as to what Daniel was facing in his day. The government came down and said, you will not pray to any other god. And Daniel said, okay, I'm going to pray to my God. And he did, in public, with the windows open. Broke the law. Listen, Paul says in Romans that we're to obey the law of the land, right? He gives us sort of this decree. But the Bible gives us examples that sort of take this a step farther. Obey the laws of the land unless the laws are in contrast to the laws of God or what God has asked of us. So Daniel was disobeying the king's order, disobeying the laws of the land, because the laws of the land were in disobedience to the laws of God. And so, being a follower of God himself, he was being ruled by a higher king. So he says, I'm going to obey the laws of my king and my God, and he obeyed those laws. Now, Darius had already declared that he was going to die if this happened. Now, Darius still has yet to find out that Daniel was the one that was being, targeted by this law. But the question is, in all of this, for Daniel and for you and I, is who is actually in control? Who is actually in control? Is King Darius in control? Who's actually in control? Who's in charge of all of these things? Who do we answer to at the end of the day? Do we answer to God? Do we fear the consequences of man? Do we fear the consequences of the lion's den or whatever it is? Or do we fear God? Who is actually in control? And when Daniel prays, he assumes the posture of kneeling. You see here it says he kneels. Kneeling is a begging posture. It's a posture of complete submission. And so kneeling is a begging posture, and we must all come to God as beggars. Listen, I think there's something very profound about this. That's why the Bible says that those who humble themselves will be lifted up. You can't come to God in pride and arrogance. You have to come to him in humility. This is the way he receives us. And so Daniel came to him in humility. He got down on his knees. He assumed a begging posture, and that's how he came. Verse 11. Then these men went as a group, and they found Daniel praying and asking God for help. Of course they did. They had spies watching him the whole time. Okay, and if they had video cameras back then, it would have all been videotaped, and they would have aired the video out on all the news channels for the world to see. Then these men went as a group, and they found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So then they went to the king. These are snakes, man. These guys are rats. They went to the king, and they spoke to him about his royal decree. And they remind the king, which, again, these guys are rats. Did you not publish a decree, O king, that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answers, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. He is falling right into the trap. They got him. By the way, why 30 days? I was thinking about this. I'm like, psychology says that it takes a minimum of 21 days, 3 weeks roughly, to form a habit. This is an interesting thing. This is the way the devil works, by the way. This is how he works. He wants to change your habits. He wants to change your routines. Or he wants to establish habits and routines in your life that are not good. And so, yes, 30 days. 30 days of no prayer except to the king and to these other gods. Establish new habits and behaviors with the people. So in verse 13, then they said to the king, and now they drop the bomb. Here it comes. Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree that you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He finally realizes, they got me. They got me, because he really liked Daniel. He's about to elevate him to the highest in the whole land. He was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel. And he made every effort until sundown to save him. But the law was the law, and he couldn't change it. Then the men, at the end of that day, went as a group to King Darius, and they said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. By the way, Jesus said to his followers, he said that as I've been persecuted, so will you. And so in Matthew chapter 10, he says, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Very interesting. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Be on your guard. You'll be handed over to the local councils. You'll be flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you'll be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, by the way, he doesn't say, but if they arrest you. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say. For it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. He says, brother's going to betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. We had a little taste of this during COVID. This evilness of people turning against their family members, against their friends. It's real evilness. We had a little taste of it here. This is what Jesus is talking about. And so children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You'll be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Jesus talks about this during the latter days in Matthew 24:7. He says, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be famines and earthquakes in various places. And all these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, which is what Daniel is about to be. He's about to be sentenced to death. And you'll be hated by all nations because of me. In John chapter 15, Jesus says, remember what I told you. A servant's not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. Someone asked the question, what would it take to get you to stop following Jesus? What would it take to get you to stop following Jesus? Would the threat of being thrown into prison or into the lion's den or to the electric chair or to whatever it is, would the threat of death be enough to get you to stop following Jesus? Would you stop following him for 30 days? Would you deny that you know him, or stop coming to church, or stop praying, or stop sharing your faith? What would it take to get you to stop following Jesus? Man, it's a question really worth wrestling with. I hope the answer for you is nothing. I hope you're so in that, and you're so sold out, that you would say, Jesus died for me. My life is his. I'm going to stop there, you guys. We're going to pick up with verse 16 next week, okay? The king gives the order for Daniel to be executed. We'll pick up there next week. Let me pray for us, all right? Lord, I want to thank you for this story. These are so wonderful, Lord. There's such application for our lives. What a gift. And thank you, God, that we can read these, we can glean from it. I pray, God, that you would help us to stand strong in our world, that we would be bold witnesses for you, that the light of Jesus Christ in our lives would be shining into the dark places. And Lord, that we would not be ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that it is the power of God unto salvation for anyone who believes. Lord, help us to be your witnesses today and every day. We love you, God, and we want to thank you for giving your life on a cross for us. And so in turn, yes, I agree with Steve Garvey that life is a gift from you, and now we have a choice in how we're going to live it. And how we live our lives is our gift back to you, God. So we want to live our lives pleasing before you, fully dedicated to you, God. We place our lives in your hands. We trust you fully. And we go from this place not ashamed. And Lord, help us to love in the way that you have loved. Help us to be your hands and feet in this world. In Jesus' name, amen. Really quick story, you guys. I got to end on this, okay? I was at Mistletoe Park today with Yanni and Diane and a few others. They were out giving out fruit bowls to the homeless because it's super hot. So they have fresh fruit and cold waters, and I was there, and there wasn't a lot of people out because it was crazy hot, but there was a few individuals there, some of the main regulars, and then if a gentleman comes walking up just as we were wrapping up, getting ready to leave. He's wearing some really torn up shorts, some ripped up shoes, no shirt, super tan, okay, because you could tell he's not been wearing a shirt, and just covered in sweat. Yanni hands him a water bottle, gives him some fruit. I grab a fork, run over to him. Yanni introduces himself, shakes his hand. I shake his hand. He tells us, "My name is Hector." And I said to him, God gave me these words to say. We didn't know what to say, but I said, "Hector, we're here to tell you that God loves you and that you're not invisible." And he just starts to weep, and he turns and he walks away. This is what being the hands and feet of Jesus is all about. I was talking to Yanni afterwards. I said, "Yanni, I don't know why I said that, but it just came out. I think it was just God just came out of me." We were talking about it, and the thought came was, God has given us the great privilege of being able to speak on his behalf. What would he say if he were standing there? It's worth thinking about. What would he say? You have an opportunity to say those words to someone else on his behalf. Anyways, just thought I would share that with you. When you encounter people, let's be good representatives of our God. Let's speak on his behalf, and let's represent him and his kingdom well. Because each one of us, including those out there, they are the objects of God's mighty love. And so let's be his hands and feet. God bless you guys, all right? Have a great day.